Washington State does not look like the kind of place these stories happen. That is exactly the problem. Forested mountains, quiet rivers, small cities where people know their neighbors, where children walk to school and teenagers head to parks on summer evenings without anyone thinking twice. Beneath all of that, something far darker has moved through this state for the last 5 decades. 10 killers. 10 patterns of violence aimed directly at the youngest people Washington had. This is their story, and it is much worse than you think. Number 1. Gary Leon Ridgway. Imagine being 16 years old and standing on the side of Pacific Highway South in South King County, Washington. Cars moving past you, the same cars that passed every other person on that stretch of road every single day, none of them stopping for you except one. The man behind the wheel looks ordinary, because he is ordinary in every way but one. That is where Wendy Lee Caulfield stood in 1982. She was 16 years old, and that stretch of South King County Highway is where the story of the deadliest convicted serial killer in American history begins. Gary Leon Ridgway was born in Salt Lake City on February 18, 1949, but he grew up in Washington, and he built the kind of life nobody photographs: a job, a house, a routine, and nothing worth a second look. He spent decades as a truck painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory in Renton. He married 3 times. He had a son. He attended church on Sundays and returned to work on Mondays, and moved through South King County the same way everyone else did. He had figured something out that investigators took years to name, that invisibility is a choice, and he had made it deliberately. While detectives imagined a monster lurking somewhere beyond the edges of normal life, Gary Ridgway was punching a time card and eating lunch in a break room and driving home on the same roads his victims had once walked. The killings began in 1982. Teenagers and young women, many of them already living on the margins as runaways, began disappearing from the Pacific Highway South corridor in South King County. Wendy Lee Caulfield was 16 years old when she vanished. Opal Charmaine Mills was 16 when her body was recovered near the Green River outside Auburn, Washington, in August of that year. Cynthia Jean Hines was 17. She was found along the same stretch of riverbank near Auburn, just days after Opal Mills. 3 teenagers in a matter of weeks, all connected by the same dark water, all chosen for the same devastating reason. Ridgway later admitted he deliberately targeted victims he believed would not be missed quickly, young girls already separated from the systems that might have protected them. He did not choose randomly. He studied vulnerability, and then he hunted it. For years, the Green River Task Force in Auburn worked the case with everything they had and still could not close the distance between suspicion and proof. Ridgway became a person of interest early. Witness accounts put him in contact with some of the victims. Prior police contacts raised alarms. Detectives from the King County Sheriff's Office brought him in for questioning. He denied everything. He passed a polygraph examination. In 1987, investigators obtained a saliva sample from him outside his home, a moment that must have felt like the beginning of the end, but the forensic science available at the time could not match what instinct already knew. Imagine how that must have felt, sitting across from the right man, feeling it in the room, and still watching him walk back out into the daylight because the proof was not there yet. The breakthrough came in 2001. DNA technology at the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory in Olympia had advanced far beyond what existed in 1987. Analysts compared that preserved saliva sample against biological evidence recovered from 3 of the earliest victims. The match came back certain. On November 30, 2001, detectives drove to the Kenworth Truck Factory in Renton and waited. Gary Ridgway walked out of the building at the end of his shift, and they arrested him in the parking lot. After 19 years, the man at the center of the Green River case was not fleeing the country. He was not hiding in some remote corner of the Pacific Northwest. He was clocking out and walking to his truck. That moment tells you more about how evil survives than anything else in this story. It does not run. It shows up on time. In June 2003, a deal was reached. In exchange for prosecutors not seeking the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to plead guilty to every murder he had committed in King County and to provide investigators with complete and truthful information, locations, admissions, and the chance to recover victims who had never been found. On November 5, 2003, in King County Superior Court in Seattle, he pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. That number would grow. In 2011, Ridgway pleaded guilty to a 49th murder after the remains of Rebecca Marrero were identified. By late 2024, all 49 known victims had finally been named. Court documents revealed that investigators brought Ridgway back to King County in September 2024 to see whether he could guide them to additional remains. Those cases remain open today. Gary Ridgway is serving 49 consecutive life sentences without parole at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. Wendy Lee Caulfield was 16 years old. Opal Mills was 16. Cynthia Hines was 17. They were not statistics when they were alive, and they should not be treated as statistics now. This case does not end with the number 49. It ends with the question of how a man spent 19 years moving through ordinary life in South King County while the families of his victims spent those same 19 years waiting for a knock on the door that might finally bring them answers. Number 2. Robert Lee Yates Jr. Imagine being told the man police have been hunting across Spokane is not a drifter, not a stranger, not someone who ever gave his neighbors reason to look twice. Imagine being told he is a decorated United States Army helicopter pilot, a father of 5, a man whose church friends described him as steady and faithful. A man whose face, in photographs taken before the arrest, looks so completely ordinary that the knowledge of what he did sits behind those eyes like something the camera should have caught but never did. That is what made Robert Lee Yates Jr. so hard to see coming, even when he was standing right in front of you. And at the heart of his case, among his youngest victims, was a 16-year-old girl named Jennifer Joseph. Before Spokane came to know his name, Yates had built a life that looked, from every angle, like the life of someone to admire. He grew up in Oak Harbor in a devout household. He attended Walla Walla College. He sang in choir. He spent more than 2 decades as a respected Army helicopter pilot and flight instructor, earning commendations and the kind of quiet public reputation that makes hindsight feel like a trick your brain is playing on you. By the late 1990s, he had a wife, children, medals, and a home on West 37th Avenue in Spokane, a house on a residential street, a house where investigators would eventually discover the body of Jennifer Joseph was found less than a block away. Jennifer Joseph was 16 years old. She had last been seen along East Sprague Avenue in Spokane, the corridor where many of Yates's victims were last known to be before she disappeared. Her body was found on West 37th Avenue, steps from the house where her killer lived with his family, coached his children, and went about the business of appearing entirely normal. Think about that geography for a moment. The victim, the home, the man inside it, all within the same few hundred feet of a quiet Spokane residential street. The killings connected to Yates stretched back to 1975, but the pattern that paralyzed Spokane built through the 1990s and then accelerated sharply in 1997 and 1998. Women and girls disappeared from the East Sprague Avenue corridor.
Bodies turned up in fields and remote areas across Spokane County. In August 1998, a woman named Christine Smith survived an attack and told police her attacker was calm, older, and described himself as a National Guard helicopter pilot with 5 children. That report was filed, and then it was buried under the weight of a drowning investigation when it should have been the key that unlocked everything. Imagine how different this story might have ended if someone had pulled that detail from the pile before it disappeared. What finally broke the case was physical evidence from a white Corvette. Detectives at the Spokane County Sheriff's Office had been building a database of Corvette owners after witnesses placed a white Corvette near Jennifer Joseph before her disappearance. The search traced back to a vehicle Yates had owned. Forensic examiners matched fibers from inside that car to evidence connected to Jennifer Joseph. Bloodstains confirmed the link. On April 18, 2000, deputies positioned themselves on the route Yates took to work and arrested him as he drove through a Spokane morning that must have looked to him like any other. In October 2000, Yates pleaded guilty to 13 murders in Spokane County and was sentenced to 408 years. Pierce County refused to fold 2 of its cases into that agreement and prosecuted him separately. A Pierce County jury convicted him of 2 additional aggravated murders in 2002 and sentenced him to death. That death sentence was converted to life without parole in 2018 when a Washington Supreme Court ruled the state's death penalty unconstitutional. He remains imprisoned at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. The most dangerous thing a predator can do is give his neighbors absolutely no reason to look twice. Robert Lee Yates Jr. spent 2 decades making sure they never did. Jennifer Joseph was 16 years old. She deserved more than a world that trusted the wrong face.
Number 3. John Allen Muhammad. Imagine dropping your 13-year-old son at school on a Tuesday morning in Bowie, Maryland, watching him walk toward the front entrance of Benjamin Tasker Middle School, then driving away with your coffee going cold in the cup holder and your mind already moving on to the rest of the day. Now imagine that before you reach the end of the street, a shot is fired from inside a car that is slowed near that school entrance and your son is on the ground. Ron Brown was 13 years old. He survived. But the decision to aim at a child walking through a school entrance changed the D.C. sniper case permanently, and the man behind that decision had spent years living in Tacoma, Washington, before the country ever learned his name. Before October 2002, John Allen Muhammad looked like someone whose life had simply come apart at the seams rather than someone capable of engineering a 3-week reign of terror across an entire metropolitan region. He was a former Army sergeant, a Gulf War veteran who'd served with discipline and received recognition for it. After leaving the military, he settled in Tacoma, Washington, and watched his life collapse. A marriage ending, a custody battle that consumed years, a restraining order, a desperate trip to Antigua with his children during a court dispute. He moved between Tacoma and Bellingham, Washington, while the walls closed in around him. The structure that had defined him in the Army was gone. What replaced it was quieter than grief and a lot more dangerous.
The attacks on the Washington, D.C. region began on October 2, 2002, in a parking lot in Wheaton, Maryland. By the next morning, 4 more people had been struck in the surrounding area. Over the following 3 weeks, 10 people were killed, and 3 were critically wounded across Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. The victims were different ages, different backgrounds, doing completely different things. Pumping gas, loading groceries, crossing a parking lot, mowing a lawn. There was no profile to build, no pattern to predict. And then came October 7th and Benjamin Tasker Middle School in Bowie,
and 13-year-old Earl Brown was shot in the chest as he arrived for the school day. That attack did not fit a pattern because there was no pattern. There was only the intention to make nowhere feel safe, and it worked. The weapon was a Bushmaster rifle, fired through a hole cut into the trunk of a dark blue Chevrolet Caprice that Muhammad and his 17-year-old companion, Lee Boyd Malvo, drove through the region like any other vehicle on any other highway. The FBI later called it a rolling sniper's nest. From the outside, it looked like a car. Inside, it was something else entirely. Schools changed their routines. People crouched beside gas pumps and ran from store entrances to their cars. Imagine trying to explain to your children why none of that was overreacting, why the parking lot was genuinely dangerous, and the school steps were genuinely exposed, and the gas station was genuinely a place to move through fast. The break came on October 17th, when a caller connected the snipers to an earlier liquor store killing in Montgomery, Alabama, and investigators recovered a fingerprint. The FBI matched those prints to Lee Boyd Malvo from a prior arrest in Washington state. An agent from the FBI's Tacoma field office recognized Muhammad's name. It had already surfaced in a tip called in to the sniper investigation. The blue Caprice was traced to a New Jersey registration. On October 24, 2002, police found the car at a rest stop on Interstate 70 near Myersville, Maryland. Muhammad and Malvo were asleep inside. After 3 weeks of a region holding its breath, the ending came with no chase, no standoff, and not a single dramatic moment. Just 2 men sleeping by the side of a highway. In November 2003, a Virginia jury convicted Muhammad of capital murder in the killing of Dean Harold Myers in Prince William County. After years of appeals, that sentence stood. On November 10, 2009, John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia. Earl Brown was 13 years old, arriving for another Tuesday at school, and someone decided that a child walking through a door was a target worth taking. Some decisions cannot be explained by any biography. They can only be remembered by the people who lived through them.
Number 4. Donna Perry. Imagine 3 cold case files sitting in a Spokane Police Department archive for more than 2 decades. 3 women killed beside the Spokane River in a single 4-month stretch in 1990. 3 families marking years without answers, watching the calendar turn while the files gathered the kind of silence that people sometimes mistake for resolution. Then imagine that silence breaking, not because of a confession, not because a witness finally came forward, but because of a federal firearms charge filed in 2012 for a crime that had nothing to do with murder. That is what makes the Donna Perry case one of the strangest cold case resolutions in Washington state history. The case did not break because someone went looking for it. It broke because science stumbled across it. In 1990, before the name Donna Perry existed in any legal record, the person investigators would eventually connect to 3 killings was known as Douglas Perry, living in Spokane, Washington. Court records confirm the murders occurred during that period, before a gender transition that took place in Thailand in 2000. By the time this case came before a jury in 2017, the challenge was not just proving who committed 3 murders. It was doing so 27 years after the fact, with a defendant whose legal identity on paper had changed in the intervening decades. The forensic evidence did not care about any of that. It pointed where it pointed.
In February 1990, the body of Yolanda Sapp, 26 years old, was found near the Spokane River. In March 1990, Nikki Lowe, 34 years old, was found in the same river corridor. In May 1990, Kathleen Brisbois, 38 years old, was recovered from the same waterway. All three women knew one another. All three were found with gunshot wounds along the same stretch of the Spokane River. And for years, even those connections were not enough to move the case. The three murders were so thoroughly stalled that investigators at one point considered whether they might be linked to Robert Lee Yates. That is how close these three women came to spending eternity filed under the wrong killer's name. Think about what that means. Their case nearly disappeared inside someone else's story entirely. In 2012, Perry was convicted in federal court on a charge of being a felon in possession of a firearm. That conviction required a DNA sample to be entered into the National CODIS database. When that sample was run against profiles from unsolved Washington state homicides, something moved. Blood found under Kathleen Brisbois' fingernail at the Spokane River recovery site matched Perry's DNA. Biological evidence recovered near Yolanda Sapp's body matched the same profile. A fingerprint connected Perry to evidence tied to Nikki Lowe. 3 cold case files, 1 database entry, 1 match that rewrote the entire investigation in a single moment.
In June 2017, in Spokane County Superior Court, the case went before a jury. Prosecutors built their argument around the forensic evidence and the pattern connecting all 3 killings along the same waterway in the same 4-month period. On June 29, 2017, 27 years after those bodies were found beside the Spokane River, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts. On July 24, 2017, Judge Michael Price sentenced Donna Perry to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. She was transferred to the Washington Corrections Center for Women in Gig Harbor. In February 2020, the Washington Court of Appeals affirmed every conviction. 3 women were killed beside the Spokane River in 1990. Their names were Yolanda Sapp, Nikki Lowe, and Kathleen Brisbois. They came within a generation of being forgotten entirely. A database query gave them back. That is not a footnote. For 3 families in Spokane, that is everything.
Number 5. Warren Forrest. Imagine opening an evidence box that has been sitting in a Clark County Sheriff's Office storage facility since 1974. Imagine lifting out an air pistol, turning it over, and finding a blood stain on the grip that nobody has ever been able to match. Then imagine sending that stain to a laboratory with modern DNA technology, waiting for the result, and watching the name Martha Morrison come back. 17 years old when she was killed in a wooded section of Dole Valley in October 1974. Her answer had been sitting in a box for nearly 50 years. Before Clark County knew what Warren Forrest had done, he looked like exactly the kind of man a small community trusts by default. He worked for the Clark County Parks Department in Battleground, Washington. He had a wife and 2 daughters, and a home in the kind of quiet corner of southwest Washington where people leave their doors unlocked. He drove the same rural roads as everyone else. He knew those roads the way a predator learns terrain, not as scenery, but as a map. Between 1971 and 1974, young women and girls began disappearing across Clark County. The Clark County Sheriff's Office has since connected Forrest's suspected activity to cases involving Jaime Grydam, Barbara Derry, Diane Gilchrist, Gloria Nolson, Norma Jean Countryman, Krista Blake, Carol Valenzuela, and Martha Morrison. That list stretches across 3 years, multiple seasons, and the full rural geography of a county where Predator learned that isolation was more reliable than anything else he could find. Imagine being one of those families in 1972 or 1973, not yet knowing there was a pattern,
not yet knowing that the disappearance you were living through was not the only one.
The first crack in Forrest's world came in October 1974, near Battleground Lake in Clark County, when a 19-year-old woman survived an abduction attempt and lived to tell investigators exactly what happened. That survival changed everything. The Clark County Sheriff's Office seized an air pistol from Forrest's home in Brush Prairie, Washington, a weapon that would sit in an evidence box for decades before anyone understood how much it held. Forrest was charged in 1978 with the killing of Krista Blake, 20 years old, whose remains had been found in the Tukes Mountain area of Clark County. He was convicted and sentenced to life. But Martha Morrison's file stayed open. Cold case detectives eventually re-examined that same air pistol. DNA from the bloodstain on the grip matched Martha Morrison, a 17-year-old whose remains had been found in Dole Valley in October 1974. Prosecutors charged Forrest in late 2019. He was extradited to Clark County in early 2020. On February 1, 2023, a Clark County Superior Court jury found him guilty of first-degree murder after approximately 90 minutes of deliberation. A judge sentenced him to a second life term. In early 2024, Clark County Sheriff John Horch re-established an active cold case team focused on crimes believed to be linked to Forrest from the 1971 to 1974 period. 7 additional cases remain open. Martha Morrison was 17 years old. The blood on that pistol grip had been sitting in a box since 1974. The answer was always there. Nobody had the tools to read it yet.
You just sat through 5 of the most disturbing cases this state has ever produced. 5 killers. Teenagers targeted on roadsides, riverbanks, and rural roads while the rest of the world kept moving like nothing was happening. And you watched every single one of them through to the end. So let me ask you something honest. If you were willing to sit through all of that, if these victims and these stories matter enough to you to still be here, then why haven't you subscribed yet? I'm not asking for a favor. I am asking you to make a decision that takes 2 seconds and costs you nothing. The families in these stories waited years, some of them waited decades for someone to pay attention. The least we can do is stay in the room. Hit subscribe right now. It is sitting right there below this video. If you have watched this far and you still will not do it, scroll down and tell me why in the comments. I genuinely want to know what is stopping you. Because 5 cases in, if this is not the channel for you, I do not know what is. The second half of this list is worse, and you already know you are not going anywhere.
Number 6. Lee Boyd Malvo. Imagine being 17 years old and lying in the darkness of a modified car trunk with a rifle in your hands, a hole cut through the bodywork, and the outside world moving past like any ordinary morning. Imagine that the man who put you there calls himself your father, that he has been the only steady presence in your life for the past 2 years, that you have taken his name, his beliefs, and his version of what the world needs from you. That is where Lee Boyd Malvo was in October 2002, in the back of a dark blue Chevrolet Caprice rolling through the suburbs of Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. He was 17 years old, and the question his case has never stopped forcing people to ask is one that courts have spent more than 2 decades trying to answer. Before Tacoma, Washington became part of his story, Lee Boyd Malvo's childhood had already been fractured in ways that made him vulnerable to exactly the wrong kind of attention. He was born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1985. His parents separated when he was young. He rarely saw his father. Court records from his later trials described long periods away from his mother and documented abuse while in the care of others. Then in 2000, when he was 15 years old and living in Antigua, he met John Allen Muhammad. Muhammad brought him to the United States in 2001, entering through Washington State.
What followed, courts would later find, was a systematic process of reshaping. Malvo adopted Muhammad's religion, his accent, even his name, calling himself John Lee Muhammad for a period. He underwent physical training. He was told who he was and what that required of him. Imagine being 15 years old with almost nothing, and then having someone hand you an identity and a purpose, and not understanding at 15 what that offer was really going to cost. By 2002, the blue Chevrolet Caprice had been modified with a hole cut near the trunk and the interior stripped to create what the FBI described as a rolling sniper's nest. The weapon was a Bushmaster XM-15 rifle. Across Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., over 3 weeks in October 2002, the attacks came in the middle of ordinary moments: a parking lot, a gas station, a lawn, a school entrance. In most of the shootings, Malvo later testified, he served as the spotter, while Muhammad fired from the trunk. But in several attacks, Malvo himself pulled the trigger. One of those shots struck Iran Brown, 13 years old, outside Benjamin Tasker Middle School in Bowie, Maryland, on the morning of October 7, 2002. Malvo was 17. One teenager aiming at another through a scope from the trunk of a car. There is no clean way to sit with that image. The entire Washington, D.C. region changed its daily behavior during those 3 weeks. Schools altered routines. People ran between store entrances and their cars. Hundreds of FBI agents worked the investigation as thousands of tips poured in. The case broke when a fingerprint from an earlier Alabama shooting was matched to Malvo through a Washington state arrest record. An agent from the FBI's Tacoma field office recognized Muhammad's name from a prior tip. On October 24, 2002, police found the Caprice at a rest stop on Interstate 70 near Myersville, Maryland, with both men asleep inside. No chase, no standoff. 2 people sleeping in the car that had terrorized a region. In 2003, Malvo was tried as an adult in Fairfax County, Virginia. The jury rejected an insanity defense built around the argument of indoctrination and convicted him of capital murder. He received life without parole. In 2006, he voluntarily testified against Muhammad in Maryland and then pleaded guilty to 6 additional first-degree murder charges with no deal from prosecutors. 6 more consecutive life sentences without parole stacked on top of the Virginia sentences. His case has moved through appellate courts ever since, raising juvenile sentencing questions that reached the United States Supreme Court. As of this video, Malvo remains imprisoned in Virginia. A Maryland resentencing hearing continues to be postponed. Lee Boyd Malvo was old enough to lie in a car trunk with a rifle and help choose the targets. He was also 17 years old when he did it. Courts have spent more than 2 decades unable to agree on what both of those things mean at the same time. That is not a legal footnote. For the families of 10 people killed over 3 weeks in October 2002, it is the part of this story that never really resolves.
Number 7. Cal Coburn Brown. Imagine sitting in a police interview room in Palm Springs, California, already in custody, already caught, and deciding to tell the detective sitting across from you exactly where the body is. Not roughly, not in the general area of, exactly. The Budget Park and Ride lot near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport in SeaTac, Washington. The car, the trunk. Imagine being the detective in that room, reaching for your phone to call King County, knowing that the moment you dial, a missing person case becomes a murder case with the suspect sitting 3 feet away from you. That phone call is the moment this story becomes something Washington State will carry for a long time, for reasons that go far beyond one crime.
Before Seattle-Tacoma, before Holly Washa, before the case that would eventually make him the last person the state of Washington ever executed, Cal Coburn Brown had been showing anyone paying attention exactly who he was for years. Prior convictions in California and Oregon, a knife assault in 1977, a later Oregon case that sent him to prison, released on parole in March 1991. Within 2 months, he had violated that parole and crossed into Washington state. The record was not ambiguous. The danger was documented. It was written, line by line, in a file that existed before he ever reached King County. In May 1991, Holly Washa encountered Brown near a hotel on the Pacific Highway South Corridor in SeaTac, the same stretch of South King County Highway that had already seen too much of this.
Brown forced his way into her day. According to the Washington Supreme Court's later summary of the case, he abducted her, forced her through a series of transactions at multiple locations to obtain money, and maintained physical control over her for many hours. The crime moved through parking lots, roads, and a motel room, every location completely ordinary from the outside, until the ordinary world had disappeared for her entirely. Days later in California, Brown attacked a second woman, Susan Schnell, in Palm Springs. That attack put him in custody, and it was in that Palm Springs interview room that he told investigators exactly where Holly Washa's body was waiting, in the trunk of a car at the Budget Park and Ride lot near SeaTac Airport. King County investigators followed those directions and found her exactly where he said. Imagine being the detective who takes that call. The body is here, this lot, this car. The suspect is already sitting in a room in California. Some moments in an investigation remove every question from the room. This was one of them. Washington charged Brown with aggravated first-degree murder in June 1991. At trial in King County Superior Court in December 1993, a jury convicted him. In January 1994, the court imposed a death sentence. Appeals stretched across 17 years. In 2009, Brown came within hours of execution before the Washington Supreme Court granted a last-minute stay. That stay was lifted in July 2010. Just after midnight on September 10, 2010, Cal Coburn Brown was executed by lethal injection at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. He was 52 years old. When Washington State formally abolished the death penalty in 2023, he remained the last person the state had ever executed.
Holly Washa's family waited 17 years for that outcome. By the time it arrived, the state was already moving away from executions for good. The case closed 2 things at once, neither one in the way anyone had planned. Number 8. Daniel Tavares Jr. Imagine reading a file on a man convicted of killing his own mother, a file that includes over 120 disciplinary reports from his years inside, documented threats against correctional officers, and descriptions from the people who worked closest to him calling him intensely dangerous. Now imagine reading that file and learning that this man has been released, has boarded a flight to Washington State, and has been living as someone's neighbor in rural Pierce County for months, while the system responsible for him has not yet sent anyone to bring him back. And then imagine learning that 2 people who had just started their lives together as a married couple are dead in their home over $50. That is the story of Daniel Tavares Jr. Not one failure, a chain of them. In 1991, Tavares killed his mother in Massachusetts. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a sentence of 17 to 20 years. During his incarceration, he accumulated over 120 disciplinary reports and made documented threats against prison officials. The people who worked with him described him in terms that appeared nowhere in the paperwork that eventually authorized his release. In 2007, following what federal court proceedings would later describe as an improper calculation of good time credits, Tavares was released from Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Norfolk. He was still facing assault charges involving prison staff. He was released anyway. Within days, he was on a plane to Graham, Washington, in Pierce County, where a woman he had met during his incarceration was living. The system had documentation of where he went. Nobody followed. On November 17, 2007, Brian and Beverly Mock were killed inside their home in Graham, Pierce County, Washington. They were newlyweds. Prosecutors said the dispute that led to the killings was worth $50. $50. 2 people dead in their own home in rural Pierce County over an amount that does not register as a motive until you understand that for Daniel Tavares, the amount was never the point. Pierce County Sheriff's investigators processed the crime scene at the Mock's Graham home and found what would close the case before Tavares could build a story around it. A palm impression in blood, a shoe pattern impression on the floor. When Tavares came in for questioning, the shoe on his foot matched the print in the blood. The palm print matched his hand. He had tried to cover the blood trail with blankets, but one print had survived everything. Imagine sitting in that interview room when detectives put those photographs on the table in front of you. There is nowhere to go from that point. He confessed. In February 2008, Tavares pleaded guilty in Pierce County Superior Court in Tacoma to aggravated murder in the deaths of Brian and Beverly Mock. He received life without the possibility of parole. Washington was not the final chapter. A 32-year-old woman named Gail Botello had vanished in Fall River, Massachusetts in October 1988. While serving his original sentence, Tavares had contacted Massachusetts prosecutors in 2000 and told them where her body was buried, in the backyard of a property on Brownell Street in Fall River, where he had once lived. He blamed others. Investigators did not yet have enough to charge him. In 2012, writing found in a prison library book revealed he had not been truthful about his cooperation. Detectives came to Washington, interviewed him again, and this time he confessed to killing Gail Botello himself. A Massachusetts grand jury indicted him in 2013. A jury convicted him in December 2015. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court affirmed that conviction in 2020. Daniel Tavares Jr. remains imprisoned, serving life without parole for the Washington murders, with the Massachusetts conviction standing alongside it. The warnings were in that file, every single one. Over 100 disciplinary reports, documented threats, people calling him dangerous in writing. None of it was enough. That is not a bureaucratic detail. For Brian and Beverly Mock, that detail is the whole story. Number 9. William Earl Talbott II. Imagine 2 young people from Saanich, British Columbia, boarding the BC Ferries crossing from Victoria to Port Angeles, Washington, on a gray November evening in 1987. Tanya Van Kuylenborg was 18 years old. Jay Cook was 20. They were making a trip into Washington State to pick up a furnace part for Jay's father's business near Seattle and planned to be home the following day. It was the kind of errand that nobody would think to remember. A Tuesday evening, a routine border crossing. They were expected back in Saanich the next day. They never came home. And for more than 30 years, the person responsible for what happened to them walked through the same ordinary world as everyone else, untouched by anything more threatening than time. William Earl Talbott II was a truck driver from SeaTac, Washington. He knew the rural roads of Snohomish County the way anyone knows the roads near where they work, from repetition, without thinking about it. Nothing about the surface of his life suggested what forensic genealogists would eventually prove he had done to 2 young people who crossed into Washington on a November weeknight and never crossed back. Over the 2 days following Tanya and Jay's disappearance, investigators found what their families had feared through a sleepless first night. Tanya Van Cuylenborg's body was discovered in rural Skagit County, Washington. Jay Cook's body was found in rural Snohomish County, miles away, across a county line, separated by a distance that felt deliberate. Their van turned up abandoned in Bellingham, Washington. Inside it, detectives found plastic ties, gloves, receipts, fingerprints, and biological material. It looked, in 1987, like a case that should be solved within weeks, but the evidence had no name to match to. The case drifted from active investigation into cold case silence, carrying 2 families in British Columbia into a wait that lasted more than 3 decades. Imagine being one of the original detectives on that case, knowing the answer was somewhere in that van, watching the years pass, waiting for the science to get there. The tool that finally got there did not exist in 1987. Forensic genealogists used crime scene DNA from the original evidence to build an extended family tree through publicly available genealogy databases, tracing branch by branch until the search narrowed to William Earl Talbott II in SeaTac. Investigators placed him under surveillance. They waited. He discarded a cup. They collected it. The DNA from that cup matched the 30-year-old evidence from the van. On May 17, 2018, detectives arrested William Earl Talbott II. 30 years of dead ends closed by a cup someone threw away. At trial in Snohomish County Superior Court in Everett, Washington, in June 2019, prosecutors presented the DNA, Talbott's palm print recovered from inside the van, and evidence placing him in the Snohomish County area where Jay Cook's body was found. On June 28, 2019, the jury found Talbott guilty of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. A judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without parole at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. That verdict became the first jury conviction in American legal history built entirely on investigative genetic genealogy. In 2021, the Washington Court of Appeals overturned the convictions on juror bias grounds. In December 2022, the Washington Supreme Court reinstated the guilty verdicts. In 2024, the Court of Appeals considered the remaining claims and left the convictions standing. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18 years old. Jay Cook was 20. They crossed into Washington State on a Tuesday evening to pick up a furnace part and never came back across the water. For 30 years, their case waited. In the end, it was not a witness who remembered. It was a coffee cup in a trash bin in SeaTac, holding the answer the whole time.
Number 10. Anthony Eugene Robinson. Imagine checking into a budget motel and passing a man in the corridor. Just another guest, just another door, just another ordinary evening at the Howard Johnson on East Market Street in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Now imagine that by the following morning, a detective is sitting in front of a security monitor watching that same corridor frame by frame, watching the same man come out of room 336 before dawn with a shopping cart, push it through the door, and bring it back out again with something inside it wrapped tight in bedding, shaped in a way that leaves no question about what it is. And then imagine that detective pulling up footage from 6 weeks earlier and watching the exact same sequence unfold in the exact same corridor, outside the exact same room, with a different woman who had walked through that door and never been seen alive again. That footage, that terrible repetition, is what made Anthony Eugene Robinson's case impossible to argue against. A jury took 30 minutes to agree.
Before Harrisonburg made his name known, Robinson was living in room 336 of the Howard Johnson Motel on East Market Street as part of his compensation from a job at a nearby chicken processing plant. A motel room, a factory floor, a city he appeared to be passing through. Prosecutors at trial told a Rockingham County jury that Robinson used dating apps to meet women, invited them back to room 336, and left behind a pattern that became impossible to dismiss once investigators lined up the dates, the receipts, and the security footage side by side.
In October 2021, Aileen Beth Redmond, 54 years old, entered room 336 with Robinson. Before dawn the next morning, the camera captured Robinson retrieving a shopping cart, returning to the room, and wheeling a body-sized bundle in bedding out through the corridor toward the rear of the property. In November 2021, Tonita Smith, 39 years old, walked into room 336 with Robinson. Before dawn the next morning, the footage showed the same sequence in the same hallway. Shopping cart, room 336, bundle in bedding. The same thing, done twice, weeks apart. On November 23, 2021, the remains of Aileen Beth Redmond and Tonita Smith were found near a tree line within direct sight of the Howard Johnson on East Market Street. Robinson was arrested the same day. What happened next widened the case far beyond Harrisonburg. On December 15, 2021, Fairfax County detectives searching near the Moon Inn Motel on Richmond Highway in Alexandria, Virginia, found a large container next to a shopping cart. Inside were the remains of Cheyenne Brown, 29, from Washington, D.C., and Stephanie Harrison, 48, from Redding, California. Investigators said they believed Robinson was responsible. And in Washington, D.C., a woman named Sonia Champ, 40 years old, had been found in a shopping cart near Union Station in the Capitol Hill neighborhood in September 2021. Her death ruled a homicide, Robinson named as a suspect. 3 jurisdictions, 5 women, the same method, appearing one location at a time across a region. The Harrisonburg trial opened in January 2025 in Rockingham County Circuit Court. The jury saw the security footage. They heard the geographic evidence connecting room 336 to the tree line recovery site. They listened to the argument that Harrisonburg, Alexandria, and Washington, D.C. were not separate crimes, but the same pattern repeating. The jury deliberated for approximately 30 minutes. Guilty on all counts. 2 charges of first-degree murder, 2 charges of aggravated murder, 2 charges of concealing a dead body. 4 life sentences plus 10 years and a $400,000 fine were recommended. As of March 2026, Robinson has not yet been formally sentenced. A hearing is set for May 22, 2026. The Fairfax County and Washington, D.C. cases remain open. Aileen Beth Redmond, Tonita Smith, Cheyenne Brown, Stephanie Harrison, Sonia Champ. 5 names, 5 women who walked into ordinary places, a motel corridor, a parking lot, a city street, and did not come back out. The most dangerous patterns are the ones that do not announce themselves. They build one frame of footage, one jurisdiction, one name at a time, until everyone in the room finally looks up and realizes they have been watching the same thing from different angles all along.
10 cases, 10 killers, and you stayed for all of them. That tells me something about you. It tells me you are not the kind of person who looks away when something is hard to look at. You sat with Wendy Lee Caulfield and Jennifer Joseph and Aran Brown and Martha Morrison and Tanya von Keilenborg and every other person in this video whose name deserved to be spoken out loud. You gave them your time
when the rest of the world had mostly moved on. And now you are going to close this video and not subscribe. I want you to really think about that for a second. You just spent nearly an hour inside some of the darkest corners of this state's history. You felt something during these stories. I know you did, because you were still here at the end. And the only thing I'm asking you to do with that feeling is click one button so that the next time we cover stories like these, your phone tells you first. That is it. One button. For Wendy, for Jennifer, for Martha, for every teenager in this video who never got the chance to grow up. The least you can do is stay subscribed so their stories do not disappear again. If you subscribed, thank you. Genuinely, it means more than you think. If you did not, I need you to go to the comments right now and tell me why. Not to argue, not to justify yourself. Just tell me what is holding you back. Because if 10 cases of this magnitude did not do it, I want to understand what would. Write it down there. I read every single one. And if a specific case from this list is still sitting with you right now, if one of these names will not leave your head, drop it in the comments. Tell me which one. Tell me why. Because the conversation that happens below this video matters just as much as the video itself. And I will be down there reading it. The stories we have not told yet are waiting. Do not miss them.